Good morning and welcome to this wonderful first Sunday of Advent celebration. We know that these rituals and traditions are, at least in my humble understanding, just that. They are rituals and traditions that beckon me to go within and to make each new season of my spiritual unfoldment a time of the second coming, as it were. The song that Jackie beautifully rendered for us has the word faith in it, which is the spiritual power that we recognize on this first Sunday of Advent. And there is one particular line in the original Italian of that song, which just is not as easy to put into the score, although Jackie did a beautiful job of translating, and thank you for that. The line that I'm thinking about that really inspires the message that I'm receiving this morning is the line that says, "The light of faith which you have lit in me forever lives in my heart." And so I really take that in for myself at depth. And then later in the song, it says, "Nella mia preghiera quanto fede c'è," which literally is a question. How much faith do I have when I pray? And so this morning, with the talk title having come through as the power of gratitude, I am reminded that in my experience, faith precedes pure thanksgiving, pure gratitude. It is through faith in just the ultimate goodness of everything in my life, regardless of how they look. It is my faith in that underlying goodness that allows me to eventually give thanks for everyone and everything. I was reminded this morning of that saying from the East, I think, that came to us, which seems appropriate for American Thanksgiving. I was thinking of all of you who got enlightened by spending time with your family this week. I know that that's probably been true in the past for me, that when we go home or go be with family, and we think we're enlightened before we get there, that sometimes we have a wake-up call. So it's kind of interesting in my personal experience this week that I did not spend time with my blood relatives, but God is so good, and there is always so much to give thanks for, that there were no shortage of teachers to test my faith this week. And truly, truly, I give thanks for that, as I remembered leper number 10 from our last time of looking at the wisdom text from a metaphysical lens. You remember the 10th leper was the only one among the 10 who went back to express gratitude to the master. So whereas all of them had faith, and 9 of them were cured, when we are looking for a restoration to wholeness in our beingness, in our awareness of the presence of God within us, I take from that parable the truth that complete restoration, a total return to wholeness, only happens when I add to my faith the power of gratitude. This morning, I would like to share with you that I have been inspired by the number 4 as we look at today as a launch pad really into a season of preparation. We'll be exploring together 4 of Jesus's teaching stories, 4 of the parables, each of which for me contain a different nuance or element of being prepared for what we're going to very loosely refer to right now as the second coming. And we'll look at that a little more closely. But I just want to begin first with these words that have inspired me from Scripture this morning. And these words are taken from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our strength comes from God, who has made us worthy to be ministers of the new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter of the law punishes with death, but the Spirit gives life. The Spirit gives life. So we think of all the times in Jesus' short ministry when he looked at those who were intoxicated by the letter of the law and kept rebelling against that and calling all of us to new life in the spirit of the law. There's been an experience for me throughout this week that I'm happy to share with you that took me back to a very important process in landing back into an awareness of unwavering faith. So whenever I am moved from that place of unwavering faith, I know that something powerful is about to happen. And the closest word I have found for that kind of experience actually comes from Emily Cady's Lessons in Truth. An experience of chemicalization is what we call it in Unity. I love the French word that captures it for me, which is bouleversé, which literally means turned ass over tea kettle, or everything is turned upside down. So I'd like to share with you the importance for the faculty of faith that an experience of chemicalization carries with it. And of course, when we are spiritually awake, it becomes possible, I believe, even in the midst of that turmoil, in the midst of that chemicalization, to be open and receptive and grateful in advance for, whoa, some new revelation, some new awareness, some new vibration or frequency in my spiritual awakening is about to happen for me. Dr. Cady says, have you ever put soda into sour milk, cider, or another acidic fluid? Have you witnessed the agitation, the action that takes place? This is because one of the substances is neutralizing the other, and the result is that something better emerges from that action. She goes on to explain, of course, that this is what happens in each one of us. When we have held fast to some false belief, in my case, it's an old pattern that came up this week. It was my false belief that I can even in a small measure love someone else when I abandon self. That is the old belief that I trust has come unglued from my consciousness once and for all. And I'm happy to say it aloud one more time, that old programming that happened very early for me in my life, the belief, the programming that I could, by abandoning self, help another. And so this came for me in the form of a 30-year relationship almost, I think to be precise, 27-year friendship in which I landed on this chemical experience, which perhaps some of you have had recently or are looking forward to, if I might say. Dr. Katie says this excited action or agitation, when it happens in consciousness, is evidence that the truth has been introduced into the person. The very newness at times of this truth creates at first new hope, new joy. However, if this person has ever been subject to any kind of error thought, the result of this chemicalization is that the old pattern returns in what I would describe with a vengeance. It comes back 100-fold. And of course, we know the human tendency then is to go into panic. Oh no, here I go, deserting self, showing up at the hospital for this friend at 10:30 at night, having no clue what has happened to this person since 8 o'clock this morning, blah, 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 and who was driving the bus, the old pattern. And so Dr. Katie reminds us that the new thought, the new spiritual understanding can seem threatened in a moment when chemicalization is happening, of falling into an old pattern. And she says even that all the new beliefs up until that moment, I call that all the spiritual understanding that I have been open and receptive to, seems to be a failure, seems to be falling away entirely. She really, really invites and encourages us right at that moment to know that it is the old mortal that is kicking vigorously against the capital T truth. There's clashing. She calls it a clashing between the old belief, which was based on falsehood, fear, and wrong thinking, and the new thinking that has really started to take hold. She says, of course, it feels discouraging at first, a feeling as if one had been caught at something disreputable. But she says that which you feel on the spiritual plane is that same kind of chemical action between the alkali and the acid on the material plane, and the thing to hold to, and I do so with faith, is that something higher and better always results. She says this is most likely to happen with an old fixed belief. Wow. So I will tell you that for the better part of 4 days, I could not and did not bring myself to gratitude for this particular chemicalization, this particular teacher. Instead, I sat with the discomfort, which is very uncomfortable, as you likely realize. And yet I know how important it is for me to fully embrace my emotional nature, because it is in my heart, it is in my emotional nature that I can allow the presence of God to reign supreme in me. And so I sat in this month of renunciation and just allowed those alkali and acidic things that were clashing in me to just have their way, because I have absolute faith based on having achieved it in the past, that fully allowed, properly entertained, and given full reign in my beingness, there is only one thing that can happen, and that is something better comes forth, because all of that eventually dissipates. dissipates. And so, considering the opening scripture of life coming through the Spirit of us, we recognize as we turn away from those false beliefs that we had been, or at least in the case of this belief that I started breaking into little tiny pieces this week, that was a falsehood. And I had clung to the belief from a lifetime of taking care of other people, starting when I was 4 or 5 years of age, that in taking care of others, I could put them first and not suffer. And so I would like to move now to the symbolic importance of the candle that Mark lit at the beginning of our service. That candle represents the attribute of faith, and it is not an accident that as we launch into a season of preparation, we arm ourselves first and we go within to check our faith quotient, our faith barometer. You know, I love it that Jesus, the master teacher, gives us ample notice about the fact that our faith at times will indeed be shaken, will indeed be tested. In preparing for the second coming, I'd like to look for a moment at what Unity actually teaches about this second coming. Unity does not prescribe to the literalist interpretation that Jesus will return at some point in the flesh. In Unity, we open ourselves through faith to understand that the second coming is present whenever we live in an unbroken consciousness of the Christhood within us. The second coming happens in me through faith and trusting that when I remain in an unbroken consciousness of my oneness with Spirit, with the Christ, that Christ comes again into my awareness, the Christhood, which never went anywhere. So this is what we read about the second coming that has been interpreted literally, and that I invite you to listen with your metaphysical ear, as I have this week. And in Matthew 24, we hear about the second coming, verses 23 to 27, Matthew 24. Then if any man shall say to you, lo, here's the Christ, or here, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs, false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you beforehand. If therefore they shall say to you, behold, he's in the wilderness, go not forth. Behold, he is in the inner chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning comes forth from the east and is seen even unto the west, so shall be the coming of the Son of Man. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Let's stop there. Let's look at those clouds. The Son of Man comes on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Metaphysically, as we prepare to a greater realization of the Christ that is always alive in us, metaphysically, these clouds that represent that which obscures the light of the Christ within. Clouds, by definition, create obscurity. Clouds, metaphysically, represent those places where I can still be seduced from the material realm rather than staying in a spiritual consciousness of the changelessness of the Christ within me. So this Advent season, as we prepare, as we notice that the word Advent means literally a coming to, we come to an awakening, a realization that the Christ arrives anew in our consciousness through faith, through changelessly trusting in the good in everything that happens, always moving ourselves in the direction of giving thanks for every single person, condition, circumstance, and thing. And in order to move towards gratitude, which is that expansive power in consciousness, some of you have heard me quote Dr. Joe Dispenza, who actually says, gratitude is the ultimate state of receivership. If gratitude is the ultimate state of receivership, and what I am receiving through my aligning with divine will, if what I am receiving is an unbroken consciousness, a continuous awareness of the Christ in me, if that is what I am receiving, it will be through a consciousness of gratitude. I will only come to staying in continuous gratitude, looking for a gift, looking for the opportunity to come up higher when I have faith that there is only good in everything that happens. And what I seek, I will find. And so when I have abandoned self, given up self for another in the name of loving that other person, then I come back to the coming of the Christ in me with faith and recognize that I can be grateful, for it has allowed me through inner turmoil and chemicalization to be thankful. Not only thankful for that person, that teacher, that circumstance, but above all, grateful for the willingness that I have to recognize that of myself I can do nothing, and that to move through this inner turmoil, I need to align with the will of the divine. So in the last part of this message, it is my privilege, my joy, and my willingness to share with you an invitation to look at 4 parables, 4 teaching stories of Jesus, wherein he points us to those things that will shake our faith, those things which will come to tempt us away from the awareness of the Christ. And I will not, obviously, in the space of a few minutes remaining, be looking or reading each of the scriptures individually. However, I will give you the citations so that you can share with me as we move into Advent the richness of not only the symbols in them, but of the warnings that come to the kinds of things that can tempt our faith, or at least tempt us and cause us to lose sight of our faith. These 4 parables, thank you, Source, that are very, very familiar, so that all of us who've been in truth for any amount of time, and even if we just got here today for the first time, these stories echo in the race consciousness. They are in the collective unconscious, as Jung would call it. And so I mention them to you. The first of these is the story of a master who met a thief. The second one is the story of the wise and evil servant. The third is the 10 virgin story. And the last one is the parable of the talents. So the story of the thief is found in Matthew 24, 43 to 44. The story of the wise and the evil servants, both, is in the same chapter, 24 of Matthew, 45 to 51. So you'll find that those two, these four parables are consecutive in scripture. You know that 4 is a number of preparation. So I take great comfort in these 4 parables being locked together, occurring in Matthew 24 and going through to 25. So the wise and faithful servant story is in 24, 45 to 51. Then we find those amazing symbols, the 10 virgins in chapter 25 of Matthew 1 to 13. And finally, the parable of the talents, also in 25, 14 to 30. It is so interesting in the first parable of the master and the thief that we extrapolate these primary symbols. In the story of the master and the thief, we are told about the importance of protecting our treasure against thievery. Well, what treasure do I endeavor to protect above all others in my life? It is my spiritual consciousness. And so in absorbing the importance of this parable of the master and the thief, I extrapolate, I take from its metaphysical meaning the assignment that I have moment by moment every day of protecting the treasure in me, which is my spiritual consciousness. Obviously, the thief is what Jesus is warning about. The thief is the mind, whatever you call it, the mortal mind, the material realm, the wonderful intellect that some of us have been intoxicated by. The thief is the mind that will absolutely, if we allow it and lose our grounding in faith, it will steal our wisdom. It will deter us from staying in spiritual consciousness at all times. Those for me are the 2 primary symbols. I encourage you and invite you. You can call and do this with me this week, because as my commitment to the attribute of faith, I will be continuing to study these 4. So feel free to do that with me. Go back into this one and find for yourself what the primary symbols are. For me, it's the thief and the treasure juxtaposed as 2 options open to me. Do I put my faith in the treasure, which is spiritual, or am I tempted by the thief, which is however it shows up for you? The second parable speaks of the wise and the evil servant, and they are of the household. The household represents my household, what the Lord has put me in charge of, which is my beingness, my spiritual identity. And so we are told to tend, at least what the job of the servants is, to tend and to care for the household, right? So what is it in me that tends and cares for my spiritual consciousness? And this speaks to my responsibility to keep returning to faith, regardless of how deterred I might be, and to recognize that caring for my mind and my body constitutes being a wise servant. On the other hand, the evil servant in this story represents what the Christ, what the master teacher is warning me about. Be on guard, because this evil servant represents enticements from the material realm, from appearances. It represents those things that keep me from discharging my obligations to spiritual law, as opposed to getting caught up in the letter of the law. What happens? And the master is so clear. He's like, look, folks, either you come from faith, Either you recognize that through the second coming, through the accepting of the Christ within, we have turned our back on enticements from the intellect, the monkey mind, the mortal mind, or we have not. But fear not, they will keep coming back as long as we're on this side of the veil. As long as we're walking through this human experience, our faith will be tested. However, he warns us, if the evil servant, the one stuck in the material realms, is driving the bus, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So for me, coming back to my experience this week, when I found myself in chemicalization, when I noticed the old pattern, when I noticed that I was about to go off a precipice into the weeping and gnashing of teeth, I remembered gratitude. I remembered that to get to gratitude, I needed to believe that this was good. I needed to absolutely not lose faith in the fact that this was happening for me, never to me. The third story in this quadrant, in this quarto, in this set of 4 parables, is the one of the 10 virgins. Some of you have heard me speak of this before. I love this because the 10 virgins really represent that aspiration in me to live in a continuous state of awareness of the Christ. They really represent, and we'll look at a minute at the duality of our humanhood. They represent 50% our spiritual aspiring and waiting for the consciousness of the Christ to stay constant. The other 5 of them go astray. And any one of us, the Master says, could be either set of virgins at any time. And who are we? The wisdom represented by the 5 who had prepared by having lots of oil in their lamps, that oil represents a sufficient amount of spiritual understanding attained in order to raise our sense experience. Okay, so to take every experience up here and elevate it to a spiritual level of understanding. That's what the oil is. It represents, where am I in my spiritual understanding? And yes, that's knowledge. And yes, we prepare by following teachers that inspire, illumine, call us up higher. But these 5 virgins represent the fact that they were ready for greater illumination. Was I ready for greater illumination through 2 different teachers, as I said, neither of whom happened to be a blood relative? So of course, for a moment, I had gratitude because I thought, oh, maybe that means I'm complete with learning from my family and understanding how loving the Spirit is. Here came 2 that are not part of my family, but whoa, were they ever major teachers, nevertheless. So their lamps were full. They came prepared with extra. They were ready for illumination. The question becomes, how ready am I in terms of my faith and moving automatically to giving thanks for spiritual illumination? And of course, what were they waiting for? Well, the time arrives when the bridegroom arrives and they have plenty of oil. You remember the panic? You recognize panic from the past, right? When fear would come to seduce a person. And this is what happens to the 5 who wake up and go, when? We ran out of oil and the groom isn't here. Can you give us some of yours? And notice, in loving themselves, the 5 virgins say, well, I guess you'll have to go and get some. Why don't you go see where you can rustle up some oil for those empty lamps, chicks? And so, of course, that's what the other 5 do. That's what I do when I'm stuck in my material realm. I think I'm in charge and I start going out there mucking around in the appearances instead of going into the silence and waiting for the feelings to dissipate, waiting for the gift to emerge, waiting for the spiritual illumination. So guess what happens? The bridegroom, the second coming, arrives. The summons, it's a summons, right? Each one of us is being summoned right this minute to welcome an unbroken awareness of the Christ that lives in me. But when the summons comes, when the call arrives to enter a new life, where were those 5 who were stuck without oil, without sufficient spiritual growth achieved through prayer, through submission, through silence? Where were they? They weren't there. Let's make sure we're there, shall we, this season? Let us say that if we are truly preparing for an unbroken consciousness of the presence within, that we bring faith, that it moves us to gratitude, and that we bless everything even when it looks like it sucks. Okay, last parable in this quarto is the parable of the talents. And for me, this holds the greatest challenge in some ways, because each of us has inherited the gifts of spirit. Each one of us has talents given by God. Rightly used, properly channeled, under the governance of divine will, our gifts increase and they bring blessings. So the teacher in me notices when blessings are not flowing freely into my life, and that's when I take stock. That's when I say, wow, am I rightly using my talents, or am I burying it, hiding it? When we hide our talents through fear, through neglect, frankly, through failure to use our gifts, guess what? There is a law. You can call it the Lord. You can call it a spiritual law that will demand an accounting. And what happens is that we have deprived ourselves actually of our divine inheritance by not accessing those gifts. So let me close by doing a quick review of what Jesus the man, Jesus the master teacher, who compressed all of his teachings into a very brief period. What is it that he said our faith would be tested by? Well, by neglect of our gifts, by a lack of studying, a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding, because remember, the oil is a prerequisite for spiritual illumination. So I need to spend time understanding the law, understanding truth. And then perhaps for me and for those of us who've been immersed somewhat in the Goldsmith teachings, trusting that only good can come from everything in life has emerged for me in the last 6 months from a recognition that all ambition, all fears, all hopes, all desires must be relinquished if I am seeking more than anything else to remember the second coming. That the second coming happens whenever I return to a consciousness of my oneness with God. So we might ask ourselves the questions that I asked myself all week. Where is my lack of preparation evident? How is it showing up? How is my time in caring for self when faced with an opportunity to do so? How prepared was I for that? Not very this week. And I'm so grateful for the gift that came from it. The second thing that I ask myself is, what is the thief? What thief is really the one robbing me of seeing the gift, of giving gratitude in advance? Where or how am I neglecting my treasure, right? My treasure having been identified as my spiritual consciousness. And so the last one is the one about the talents, and where am I hiding those talents which need to be more clearly expressed. Deep breath. Just notice the life that is coursing through you. Just notice the faith that allows spiritual illumination to be our foundation this morning. We rest strongly in that faith as we move into a time of even brief communion, of brief realization, of brief recognition that each one of us is the light. Each one of us is moving with our lamps full towards a season of illumination, of expansion, and of greater spiritual understanding.